Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We have a return guest today. I'm speaking with Air Force retired Brigadier General Rob Spalding about his new book, War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination. We spent a lot of time on the show focusing on Russia, Ukraine. So we decided to focus a bit back towards the China issue, China question, of which we answer a few during this episode. This book is all about General Spalding's interpretation of a famous book. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. It's from the late 1990s, and it effectively catalogs the mentality and the approach that has led China to challenge the US in the Asia Pacific, especially relevant in the context of Taiwan. So today's episode is all about how this could play out in a future conflict, what this basically means for the future, how he thinks we should adjust our actual approach to the country. So many great things. If you enjoy the book, you check out our bookshop. And of course, we'd love for you to check out our Supercast subscription as well. Hope you enjoy this one. General Spalding, welcome back to the Realignment.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, we recorded this originally in person in November 2019. So this is one of our last ever in-person pre-COVID recordings. So I just want to start off with a useful anecdote you gave at the start of the book, which is you said, as an Air Force officer in the 1990s, you were a B-2 bomber pilot. You really focus on an intellectual level at taking a step back and looking at the big picture. What would you say the big picture is for the conversation we're about to have today?
It's that the internet and globalization has really changed the way that you look at conflict on a global basis. It's today, I think, much more about ones and zeros and dollars and cents and much less about weapons, although weapons continue to be used. But I would say that of the things that are useful and actually effective in terms of actually creating geopolitical outcomes, the ones and zeros and dollars and cents matter much more.
So we're referencing obviously a B-2 bomber. This is a stealth bomber. This is really the height of 1990s American post-Desert Storm military dominance. How much do you think advanced weapons platforms like the B-2 Spirit, like let's say the B-21, other types of technologies are going to make a difference in the context of this conversation?
Well, I don't think it's going to make a difference in the context of the competition or the conflict, the cold conflict that's coming between the US and China or the US and Russia. I think it's going to continue to be used on the outskirts, in proxy conflicts. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good example of a proxy conflict that, very much mirrors the North Koreans' invasion of South Korea during the first Cold War. So I think we're starting to see history replay itself. Those weapons and that killing is going to be effectively used on those battlefields. But I think in terms of how the major powers confront each other, it's going to be much more in the finance, economics, and data realms than in the actual kinetic.
And as I said, you came on the show before. Normally, I would say, hey, listeners, just re-listen to the episode. But November 2019 doesn't feel just like 2.5 years ago. It feels like 10 years ago. So I just want you to quickly sum up what your argument was when you said that we are in the middle of a stealth war.
Well, what I was trying to say was that, I had learned a completely different form of warfare, one where military force was used to achieve a political outcome, one in keeping with the traditions that Clausewitz talked about when he said war is politics by other means. And I think what I had learned in watching what the Chinese Communist Party had been doing for over 2 decades was that they had really embraced this idea of using the everyday, our financial transactions, our trade, our geopolitical relationships, our academics to move the world in a way that was favorable to what their interests were.
And the key thing here in this story, aside from just COVID, obviously, which we'll get into, was in between our two tapings, obviously, you had a transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. You specifically state that the Biden administration has gotten some things right, but they are still undercounting the broader picture here. How would you rate this transition when it came to approaching these issues?
Well, I would say that I'm genuinely happy that, for the most part, they didn't get rid of the tariffs, although they have rolled some of them back. I think they have embraced a lot of the changes that the Trump administration implemented. But, and I don't think this is owing completely to the Biden administration, because you have the U.S. corporate sector and the U.S. financial sector lobbying both the Hill and the executive branch not to be harder on China. But for the most part, they have continued a trend that was started in the Trump administration of half measures. There was a lot of good, and there continues to be a lot of good, but the Chinese Communist Party is so effective on such a broad basis that a little bit of good is not going to overturn kind of all the things that they're doing.
I want to get to the specific claims you're making about China in the book to really set the stage. So you specifically refer to China and obviously the Chinese Communist Party as an explicit enemy. And as you state, back when you worked at the NSC during the Obama administration in 2014, that was a very controversial way of putting it. So explain why that's controversial and why you explicitly think the term enemy is an appropriate one.
Well, we like to say that they can be either cooperative or competitive, but we never want to call them an enemy. And that's really something that I think comes from what I was saying, where the corporate sector and the financial sector really do not want that term to be used vis-a-vis China. And I think also from the national security and foreign policy establishment within Washington, D.C., they're very hesitant to use the word enemy. And I think we've been conditioned to think in that way, not just by our own corporate and financial sector, but also the Chinese Communist Party themselves. One of the favorite phrases they have is that we shouldn't take a Cold War attitude, or we shouldn't have a Cold War approach, or we shouldn't use Cold War thinking. And the reason is because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was cut off from the innovation, technology, talent, and capital of the West. They were isolated, and the Chinese Communist Party loves its connection to the West for these things. It doesn't love its connection for the ideals of the West. And so, if it fears that if these ideas of Cold War thinking are actually brought into play, then we might actually do something that would prevent them from having such sway over our society. So this is I think, a campaign that they're waging. It's a narrative control. It's a narrative campaign that they're waging on the West to keep us, from saying we're entering a Cold War. And for the most part, we play along and not calling them an enemy, besides the fact that they call us an enemy internally. So when they speak to themselves about us, they say the United States is an enemy. And so by not saying they're an enemy and not saying that we're ending a Cold War, it disarms us rhetorically, and it also forces us to, have to take basically half measures. It's very effective, in terms of one of the strategies that they're using.
Do you worry that one of the more devil's advocate arguments for avoiding the term enemy is it's going to constrain our flexibility and options when it comes to very, very complicated scenarios? So what do you respond to that concern with?
Well, I think we're already constrained. And I think the constraint happened, with the invention of the nuclear weapon. And, you could make a case that the Atlantic Charter that was signed by FDR and Churchill in 1941 and kind of became the template for the international order after the end of World War II. You could say that what restrains major war in the vein of World War I or World War II, where tens and hundreds of millions of people were killed, what restrains us from that is the international order and the documents like the Atlantic Charter. You could make that claim. I would say that's only partly correct. The other thing that you would have to look at is the invention of the nuclear weapon really made warfare dangerous for the human race. And I think that is restraining in and of itself. And so we have enough restraint in terms of violence because of the technology that we created. But in using rhetorical restraints, it actually prevents us from protecting ourselves from the kind of competition that our society in the West was really never prepared for, and that is the undermining of our societies from within.
Yeah, because I want to put a really strong pin on what you're basically suggesting, which is because of the existence of nuclear weapons, there's no world where we say, hey, let's invade China in the manner that we invaded Iraq or the manner that we decapitated the Taliban regime. Is that basically what you're suggesting? So we are just so structurally limited by the existence of nuclear weapons that the hypothetical wouldn't exist in a way that it existed pre-World War II. Is that a way of putting it?
That's exactly right. It's a completely different ball game, and because it's a different ball game, that and the invention of the internet and the relaxation of the rules that enabled globalization has given us a completely different battlefield from which to conduct war. And war is primarily a political act. We know this. It is achieving a political outcome using other means. And in the case of what the unrestricted warfare really talks about, it is using means that, quite frankly, we have associated with the spread of peace or the spread of democracy or the spread of transparency and openness. In fact, those tools, the internet and globalization, have been used to reverse all of the gains that we made after the end of World War II and with the Cold War, leading to the victory over the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So we made tremendous gains, but have been completely rolled back because of the existence of this new battlefield and the fact that we never positioned our societies to be successful in this kind of a war.
Yeah, and we'll get to unrestricted warfare. Just a couple more specifics here. And this was what was interesting in the way you framed the 2014 disagreement, which was many folks believe, and this is a right and a left thing when it comes to the enemy phrase, is that there are opportunities for cooperation. So if you are more left-leaning, if you're a Democrat, if you're John Kerry specifically, you think the opportunity and the necessary thing to do is cooperate with China on climate change. This is a little more bipartisan, but there's also this idea that you need China's cooperation to constrain the North Korean threat. So you make this argument specifically that actually China doesn't believe either of those issues are in their interest to actually resolve, but address the China fakery point, but then also articulate why you don't think there even is an opportunity there, regardless of the terms we're using.
Well, they know that we want to prevent climate change, or we want to prevent environmental destruction. That is in our DNA. It's something that we have worked through as a society. We were polluting the land and the air and the water, just like China does today. But then we had, this ability through our society and the rule of law to address that, to have activism, and to eventually pass laws that made, that kind of behavior illegal. So I think when you think of environmental destruction or climate change, we have an interest in seeing the world preserved from an environmental standpoint. At the same time, we want to ensure and preserve the democracy that is South Korea. We want to protect our ally, Japan, and we see North Korea as a threat. So we also want to solve that. In terms of what the Chinese Communist Party wants, they want to continue to have access to our innovation, technology, talent, and capital. That's in spite of the fact that we know that they're stealing intellectual property. We know that they're undermining our universities and our political system and influencing our corporate sector and our financial sector. And so we seek to restrain them in doing so. But what happens is when we go to them and say, hey, we want you to stop doing these things, then because of the existence of this need to solve climate change and the North Korea problem, we disarm ourselves because the Chinese Communist Party knows that those are two issues it can use to prevent us from protecting ourselves. So it's a valid negotiating strategy on their part. And since, by the way, in China proper, coal is increasingly being used in spite of their commitment, their so-called commitment to climate change, in spite of their joining the Paris Accord. The North Koreans have access to nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile technology, in spite of the fact that they've had pretty strict non-proliferation regimes for decades. We know that technology comes from China. We know that the Chinese aren't doing anything to on behalf of the climate, but these issues are so powerful in our own political system that the Chinese Communist Party can leverage them to disarm us from protecting us in other places.
So something I'd want to then get to then is obviously the title of the book, what it's referencing, which is Unrestricted Warfare. Introduce the text, what are the central ideas, who wrote it, those bits, and then we'll get into the specifics.
Well, it's written by two PLA at the time lieutenant colonels, Chao Liang and Wang Shangsui. I don't know.
Could you clarify what the PLA is for non?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. So People's Liberation Army. So it is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. People think it's the national military of China. No, it is a military that is responsible to the Chinese Communist Party for preserving the Chinese Communist Party's survival and especially its control over the Chinese people. So it doesn't represent the Chinese people. It doesn't represent the Chinese nation. It represents the Chinese Communist Party. These two colonels, or lieutenant colonels at the time, were tasked with coming up with some principles to define how they might deal with the fact that at the time, China was a backwater when it came to military capability. The U.S. had demonstrated its absolute superiority during the first Gulf War, and they recognized that the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA could not directly challenge the United States militarily. But what was happening because of the ending of the Cold War and this loosening up of the restrictions of economic and political and social and academic connections between the authoritarian regimes of the world and the free societies, these two realized that the two things that were happening at the time, the internet was nascent and globalization, was going to give them the opportunity to have the ability to bring in the innovation and the technology and the talent, and in particular, the capital, the wherewithal to rebuild their nation. And in that process, restore the greatness of China. So the problem that they had recognized, however, was that in 1989, during the Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party realized that they were getting this, ideology transfer that was coming with those, with the capital and the innovation, and they needed to restrict that. And so what they laid out in doctrine is exists in militaries everywhere. We have it in the United States, and it basically comes from lessons learned on the battlefield that is, from which you distill certain principles. In the United States, we have joint doctrine, we have air doctrine, we have land doctrine, we have sea doctrine, and it's used to provide those principles that leaders and planners use to craft campaigns and strategies for defeating an adversary on the battlefield. Well, what they were seeing was the evolution of this new battlefield, and they were looking at the lessons learned. And there's a lot of lessons learned. One of the big ones that they talk about is the Asian financial crisis, and how George Soros had, precipitated the Asian financial crisis in their mind, and how, that was as much a danger to a nation as a military attack. And so looking at these different environmental things that they were seeing with the internet and globalization, and the lessons they had learned from watching that play out in other societies, they formulated a set of principles that then could be used to create an advantage on that battlefield. And that's essentially, what in effect unrestricted warfare is.
And something I want to get to a couple of things on this. So firstly, why did these two lieutenant colonels have so much weight? Like, you obviously retired as a brigadier general. You are deeply aware of the fact that there are, I'd say, thousands of lieutenant colonels in the US military. I'm sure we could agree that if two lieutenant colonels were to write a paper of this type of ambition, it would not make that much impact. I'm sure there are plenty sitting in dustbins, virtual or otherwise. Why did they specifically have so much influence in their system?
Well, I think, and you go back and look at the document, they were so prescient and they were so, I think, insightful when it came to analyzing these trends that were coming together. It just happened to be, I think they were in the right place at the right time with the right perspective to, again, doctrine doesn't come out of thin air. It comes from taking a, honest look at what's going on around you and, creating, a set of principles, distilling it into a set of principles. John Boyd was very influential in the military, more so in the Marine Corps than the Air Force from which he came. But nevertheless, his ideas, the OODA loop, for example, is widely taught in education. Another gentleman, John Warden, who led the strategy development for the first Gulf War. Also, those are two colonels that were influential. So we do have throughout history influential the top general, but he took the time to think about it. And Giulio Douhet, another Italian, Billy Mitchell, these were people that thought about war, took the time, and then had keen insights that ended up being part of the fabric of what we understand about warfare. I just think that, quite frankly, because these guys came from China and because their ideas were so out of character from what we know as war, never really, I think, got the credit that they deserve for so vividly laying out, there was no iPhone when they wrote about this. There was no mobile internet. There was no ability to foresee, I think, in the way that they did, where things would go for the average person, much less for somebody that's thinks about war. Because if you think about what they were saying, guys like me who thought that they knew everything about war, it was totally outside of what we could see. Like, perceptually, when I read that document the first time, it really made absolutely no sense. And that just tells you, in my mind, how forward-looking they were and how they had. This probably has to do with the fact that they were Chinese, and the fact that the People's Liberation Army is a political wing of the Chinese Communist Party. I think they were far more political and far more savvy in terms of politics, and that enabled them to see this. But I think they were just in the right place at the right time, had the right frame of mind from which to think about these problems, and then did a good job. Not the best job at writing it, because it's really dense and hard to follow. But if you can break through that, you can see the wisdom in what they were writing.
It's funny. I tried to show off, and I purchased. It's available for free, as you know. I purchased a copy, and you were not you were not exaggerating when you say it's very dense. I really am suggesting to the listeners that if you want to show off like I do, stick with War Without Rules first, and then get to Unrestricted Warfare if you think is there. So what's actually, and I just want to editorialize for a second. I think what's useful, what you just said here, is it's not that they write this book or they write the paper, the white paper, and then a young Xi Jinping reads it and then implements. It's that they were incisive about the logical, let's just say, implications of developments in the 1990s. And if history proceeded in the way they described, it's because they were onto those trends, not that this was a master plan per se. Is that a way of putting it?
It is. And the other thing is, it inspired a whole bunch of other writing within China. And I think that's the other thing that people miss. That inspiration came because they were so insightful. And, it's funny because you talk to Chinese scholars and they say, oh, that really didn't, mean much in China, in terms of national security. But yet, Chao Liang is, got promoted as a general officer, and he's teaching at National Defense University. So, and it spawned a whole, a whole cottage industry of thinking about warfare in a completely different way.
So then another question on the political aspect of warfare, because I think it's really interesting how you specifically said the PLA is best understood as a military arm of a political party rather than just a military, in the sense that the US Army, the US Air Force, Marine Corps, et cetera, exist. How do you see US military officers, you being a retired one yourself, able to understand these whole of society issues? Because I speak through this podcast, I speak with a lot, I've spoken with retired generals such as yourself, lieutenant colonels, people who teach at the war colleges, et cetera. And obviously their defense policy analysis is great. The foreign policy analysis is great. I would say a lot of the time, let's just say like political economic analysis is fine to a well-informed New York Times reader, just being entirely honest. So like, how do you, as now currently a civilian, obviously, how do you think about this idea of military folks having to think about these political and economic issues outside of the typical strategic analysis part?
Well, if you look at all of our professional military education, it's really clear. The general's job, and I'm talking about Clausewitz and Jomini, the general's job is to prepare for the war. It's not his or her responsibility to figure out, whether to go to war. And if they are tasked with going to war, then they're supposed to get wide latitude with which to prosecute the war. In other words, give me the means and tell me, what you want, and then I will go achieve it. And then I want to study the profession of arms. It's almost as if, I am a dishwasher working in a kitchen. I don't want to know anything about what the kitchen is doing. I'm just going to wash the dishes. And so in many ways, we are stunted by the way that we have grown up as a profession of arms. Clausewitz says war is politics by other means, but don't worry about the politics. That's for the country's leaders. Your job is to figure out the war. Well, if war is politics by other means, and somebody comes along and says, okay, well, I think politics is war, and therefore the way that I should pursue it is through politics. If that is the case, then we as a profession of arms are completely disarmed. We're not given any training on how to navigate, politics. If politics is warfare, we're out of the game. We can blow things up, right? And this really was brought home to me with the islands in the South China Sea. The Chinese are building bases in the South China Sea, and the president wants the military to come up with options. Well, what can the military do? We can blow up the islands. That's what we would do if we were military. Well, but that's not what the president wants. He doesn't want to go to war with China. Well, this is the beauty of war without rules, because it forces, the people that are, charged with becoming professional warriors of our society, it basically takes them off the field because they're not given the tools, they're not given the authority, not given any responsibility with trying to figure out how do you navigate a political war. So, I mean, in many ways, it is, I believe, the only corollary to this is the Maginot Line, during World War II. We've created this professional class of warriors in the West that really have no way They don't have the tools. They don't have the training. They don't have the professional education. They don't have the savvy with regard to finance or economics or trade. Any of the tools that you would use in this game of political warfare, they are not schooled in. And so they are, but yet they are the ones that are tasked with defending the nation, or at least being the professionals that we call on. They're the dishwashers we call, but they don't have any of the tools. And then the people that you would call, the people that work in the Commerce Department or the Treasury Department or the State Department, or maybe the Department of Justice, they don't think in terms of war. They're not taught to be a warrior class. So this is why what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is so effective.
And let's be fair to your former colleagues in the military and focus on the civilian side for a second, because, the deeper I delve into these issues, the more I dislike when civilians say the cliched, well, we don't have a draft anymore, so the civilians don't know how the military works, and that's all this big problem. There's some very serious arguments against reinstating the draft that would cause probably far more problems than actual advantages relative to the all-volunteer force. But once again, I think the idea that cliche is getting at is this idea that the civilian side of things has a weaker and weaker grasp of almost the military aspect, especially now, to your point, where we are pivoting from this Middle Eastern centric conflict and pivoting towards this much more great power centric one, where a lot of the rhetoric and the language and even the concepts at a strategic and tactical level just have nothing to do with the war on terror. So how do you see the civilian side of this picture when it comes to strategic difficulties dealing with unrestricted warfare?
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of this thing. And it's really the beauty of war without rules. See, the civilian side, the political leadership, are absolutely perfectly oriented for combat, because they do it to each other. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party is counting on, right? Because the way that they go at our social fabric is to create and exacerbate the divisions between us. And so rather than inspiring this collective that can fight at the same level with the Chinese Communist Party, if they saw the Chinese Communist Party as a political adversary, right? If the Democrats saw the Chinese Communist Party as big an enemy to them as they see the Republican, they would be very effective at fighting this war, because it is a political war. But because of the way that the Chinese fights, and it creates these divisions, it exacerbates these divisions, then instead of coming together and going after the chief political opponent that they have, they go further after each other, and it causes even further social disadhesions. And this is really the beauty of war without rules. And it is, in a sense, we have within ourselves the understanding of how to defeat the Chinese Communist Party if we could only see them as a political adversary. But unfortunately, that's the challenge. And it becomes one of perspective and thinking about the problem and understanding the challenges we face, and understanding the context that, I saw this at the White House when I had this series of what I called winning without war, where we debated these different types of war, economic warfare, lawfare, and we got into these heated arguments. And I'm like, guys, it's not us in this room. It's over there, and we have to think about these in terms of, it's not right versus left, or Trump versus anti-Trump. It is about understanding how our society is being undermined from within, understanding that enemy is outside of our borders and exacerbating these divisions, and coming together and actually countering them together. I think if we could do that, then we would be smart enough, because the same type of tools that the Chinese Communist Party used to undermine us, the parties use against each other here.
I'm interested in your use of the word defeat, because once again, as we established early on in the episode, there is no one short of, I can't even think of anyone who believes this, who thinks the objective is to explicitly, aggressively enact regime change in Beijing. Like, interestingly enough, there's actually some interesting thought out there that even if China were a democracy, it's not quite unclear they wouldn't still have a lot of these issues actually going on from a pure like nationalism perspective. But that said, like, what does defeat mean? Does defeat mean the status quo is maintained? So Taiwan isn't invaded, Hong Kong, the rights move in the right direction, slave labor, like what do you mean by that term?
Well, I think, in terms of, I mean, even I think the term defeat implies that you look at war in a Western context, right? If you look at war in a Western context, war is a finite, game. There's a beginning and there's an end. Just in considering what that term means that you're not contemplating the conflict in the same way the Chinese do, which says it's continuous. You are always at war. You never stop being at war, and that war means that you have to continuously fight for advantage in the geopolitical world. And so, what I would say is there is no defeat, right? Because in defeat means that you've reached an end. And I don't think you reach an end here. I think in fact, as a nation, what we should seek to do, what we should strive to do is continue to exist and continue to exist in the context that, we were founded upon, which is these ideas of liberty and rule of law and the ability to live the life that you want to live. Doing that requires that you continuously struggle against those outside forces that are seeking to undermine and overthrow those ideals. So I don't look at the fact that we need to defeat China. What I look at is we need to remain a player in the game in a way that enables us to both maintain our own principles and values, but also sustain some element of that outside our borders. Because, being an island unto ourselves, the only democracy in the world, is not going to work out well for us. And, I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we're not going to have authoritarianism or totalitarianism in the world. It is the natural state of mankind. And when you look at the writings of Alexander Hamilton and a lot of the founders, they recognize that if you didn't create a system that allowed for the fact that people will try to be dictatorial if they can be. The Democrats will try to be all powerful. The Republicans will try to be all powerful if they can. So you have to create a system that fights that, and then give the citizenry the rest of the rights, to include the right to bear arms, in case all that fails. That is the thing that we should fight for, but it's a continuous struggle. It's not going to end. And if at any time that we think it has ended, then we begin to create the kind of backsliding that we've seen since the end of the Cold War. The reason that happened is because we believe, we had one. Okay, time to put all the weapons away. No more time, no more need to defend ourselves.
This is the part where I have to speak for the more skeptical part of the audience and basically say, let me just pose the following for you. This isn't likely what they're thinking. They are thinking you are phrasing this in existential terms when you discuss our domestic side, liberty, the ideals of the Constitution, et cetera. What if, because in many ways you could argue that the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in behavior that's reminiscent of obviously the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, other totalitarian regimes, but leave Taiwan alone, as in let Taiwan go. If they take it, they take it. Except, as we already have operationally, that Hong Kong is lost. Maybe you do some economic things to make it so that Western China, Xinjiang, isn't relying on slave labor as much, but largely just leave it alone and accept the truth there. For a lot of people, that seems like an okay enough trade. Why do you disagree with that? Not morally. They wouldn't say that that's a moral trade, but they say that that's an inevitable trade.
Right. So first of all, let's just address Taiwan. I don't believe Taiwan can be saved. The Chinese have far too much power, and I don't think we should fight over Taiwan. I think that creates a risk of nuclear war, which could be, detrimental to humanity writ large. I do think that we have an obligation, a humanitarian obligation, to help the Taiwanese escape widespread slaughter if that should come. So things like the Berlin airlift come to mind when I think about how we should react with regard to Taiwan. But when you're talking about existential threat, to me, we have to understand, in my mind, what existential threat means. Existential threat means that the world that we conceived, at least here in the borders of the United States, where the law of the Constitution was predominant and it granted, everybody, equal rights. That document, if it becomes essentially undermined by our relationships with a foreign power that seeks to undermine those ideals because it fears them gaining traction in their own population. Here I'm talking obviously about China. If that happens, so when you talk about existential, to me, what that means to me is that you lose political independence and sovereignty, meaning you no longer have the ability as a people to live according to the dictates of the law of the land, which is the Constitution. And I think one of the things that we have seen is that the Chinese Communist Party does have the ability to put pressure on that. And I think one of the best examples of that is the coronavirus. We adopted policies that were not in the CDC's game plans, that were not in the World Health Organization's game plans, and we adopted them because we were told that the Chinese Communist Party had a much better approach to tackling the coronavirus. So we basically adopted policies that were counter to many of the provisions within our own Constitution about civil liberties and the extent of government power over citizens. So this is the thing that when I talk about existential, and a lot of people think existential means, okay, well, every human is wiped off the face of the earth, or we have nuclear Armageddon. But I think in the case of what these two PLA colonels were talking about, it is and they say this, they say all means, military and non-military, to get your enemy to accept your interests. That means that we lose political independence and sovereignty. We lose the ability to make the way that we want to live as a people. And I think therein lies the problem. And that's not I don't advocate going to military war, because I worry about the escalation of nuclear war. But I do worry that we're not doing enough to protect our independence and political independence and sovereignty. And that's what I call the existential threat.
Oh, well said. And that actually helps clarify what the term means. And so I think the key way of summing this up, from your view from the book, right, like unrestricted warfare represents, separate from the military side of it, the using economics, technology, diplomacy, and then media to the division part you're speaking to really challenge American power to the existential sense that you're describing here. So I want to get to Ukraine in a second, but just to like tie a bow on this part, like what is like the top line headline response to that beyond just awareness? Because once again, your previous book is called Stealth War. The response to that is, okay, let's not have that be stealthy anymore. Let's talk about it. Like what is the direct response to this war without rules?
Yeah, the only way that I can see that we can extract ourselves from it is to decouple, like completely decouple, have the same type of, bipolar world that we had during the first Cold War, and then with our allies and partners, only invest. And when I say invest, capital, technology, innovation, talent, we only invest in ourselves. And we exclude, the authoritarian regimes. I think that is the only way that we can actually preserve ourselves. Use the whole headline of Twitter going on right now. I think one of the things that you have is you have these global platforms where you have these authoritarians that are piling in, and we have no idea of sifting between good and bad. And so there's a lot of fragging of our own citizens going on. And I think that's one of the things that Elon Musk is responding to, is how do we get the bots out? How do we get the bad actors out? And if we're going to fight, let it be an internal fight, not a fight where external parties come in. And I think this is where we have to separate, because, like I said, war without rules is really amplified because you have these outside interests coming in. And it's funny because we have these debates all day long about Russia influence. What about Chinese influence? And it is true, the Russians influence and the Chinese influence. And we used to do a lot of this during the Cold War. Unfortunately, we dissolved the U.S. Information Agency. We really stopped. And we understood active measures, but there was no internet. There was no globalization during that time. So I really think separating and then really beginning to invest in ourselves again, there's going to be a lot of healing that happens just because of that. This problem that we have in our society today is not just about us. It's also about the outsiders that are helping make that worse.
What event is necessary to cause the drastic separation you're describing? Because once again, we're having this conversation 2.5 years later. It wasn't COVID. It wasn't, not even the TikTok. This is the standard. The TikTok sale couldn't even be conducted during COVID. If there was ever when would this very difficult thing be pulled off scenario, it was that. It hasn't been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has obviously been quasi greenlit by China. What would have to happen? And once again, and this is why I love your book and your framing, because your point is, I was about to say, what's the Pearl Harbor moment? But that suggests that there's going to be a Chinese attack on the bases in Okinawa, which actually speaks against the strategy that you've described in these past two books. So what would a non-kinetic version of that event look like?
Well, so that's the whole point, right? Don't have a Pearl Harbor. I mean, the only thing that you really, it's funny because the Japanese, there's this famous quote. It was maybe Yamamoto that says, we've awakened a sleeping giant, after Pearl Harbor. The Chinese learned that lesson. We are not going to have a Pearl Harbor. It is, either we wake up on our own, or we basically succumb to their methodology, which is to use our own people, our own elites against us, our own our own corporate leaders, our own financial leaders against us, because they're incentivized to do so. I think, though, one of the things I've seen, and I don't see it being reported quite enough, is that you mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are starting to see capital outflows now, and I think it has to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if I had to say, is there an event that may be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and is it an event that's plausible or actually probable? It is the invasion of Taiwan. I think that's what's going to precipitate the beginning of the end. I think what Xi Jinping has done is basically, and what he's continuing to do, is further protect his economic and political system from any kind of outside attack like Russia has experienced after the invasion of Ukraine. And but the good thing is, maybe I'm hoping maybe that's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
And my initial instinct to that is to say, given everything that's happened in the past 2 months, it would be an insane decision to invade Taiwan, in the sense that, in the sense that it would destroy, basically, because to your point, it would dissipate the entire strategy that was described here.
I am so it's there, and I'm not. It's just, I had a conversation 2 weeks before the invasion with a gentleman who, retired general officer, and he's like, I don't think Putin's going to invade. And I'm like, that's why he's going to invade. And I think, one of the things that you find in studying these systems and these people who lead these systems is that they have these tendencies, and one of the tendencies is overreach. And I think Putin demonstrated it. I think Xi is going to demonstrate it. They can't help themselves. It's part of the system. I think it's partly due to the fact that, over time, that system, those leaders tend to push away those who might have prevented them from making those kinds of a decision. So I think, recognize, and ultimately, what's interesting is this may be the thing that saves us is another tendency of humanity, and that is to basically listen to our own counsel. And so in our system, we don't want anybody to have ultimate power because ultimate power can be corrupting. And so but we still have our own issues because of that. But in the system that China has and the system that Russia has, you have these leaders who have done their utmost. They don't trust anybody, and so they want to have their leadership be people that basically are yes men. And so I think this is why, and this is for us, something that we have to be prepared for, that they overreach, and then therein hopefully lies our salvation.
And this is where I'm compelled to give us a bit of a, I want to be a little positive as we near the end here, just that the one bit of pushback I'd have to you is the difference between the invasion of Ukraine and an invasion of Taiwan is that now there is the data point of Ukraine, in the sense that if you're Putin, once again, seems crazy to us, but you've had 8 years of fighting in Eastern Ukraine. You had weak sanctions. You had all sorts of European kowtowing. The thought is that you could take the city in 3 days. But now the West has made clear, and the broader allied sets of the world, that pushback would actually occur. So you don't think at all that data point is going to, let's just say, push aside the totalitarian authoritarian instinct towards overreach, like you're saying?
Well, I go back to unrestricted warfare and the world that the Chinese Communist Party built for themselves. After that, one of the things that they did is they gave themselves a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls. One of the things that we have gone after in Russia is their financial system and their connection and reliance on the West for their financial system. China has none of those issues. And the PBOC is the only entity in the world that can convert the renminbi. And then they've gone after this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. So they've been creating their own economic system where they can trade totally in their own currency. They can give renminbi to the Russians for energy. They can give renminbi now to the Saudis for oil. So I think and they have had a good opportunity to see what the United States did to Russia as a result of this invasion of Ukraine. They were already looking to an alternative of SWIFT called CHIPS that they're using for currency exchange, amongst their nations. They have currency swap agreements with the UK. They have currency swap agreements all over the world. So, the things that we did, they studied, and they've made sure that those things we're not going to be able to do that to them. So I think it's not going to be, hairless in terms of it's not going to be that they're not going to have some difficulties, but in terms of what the Russians have had to endure and what they will have to endure, I think they're already prepared for it.
Yeah, that's a helpful framing. So finally, I want to just end on this because your publisher helpfully sent along your specific notes on Ukraine, Ukraine today, China tomorrow. So I want to really give, because actually, just to sum up the episode, it seems that the point of agreement we just have here is that the type of policy you're describing as ideal, a decoupling is going to require some precipitating event beyond just COVID and the past 2 years, beyond the Olympics, beyond Daryl Morey and the Houston Rockets. It would be what we could agree would be an invasion of Taiwan. You describe it as heavily air power focused. It's not going to be this. We've had episodes with folks talking about how the Chinese are going to have to cross 50 miles of ocean, which causes all sorts of vulnerabilities. You saw this with the sinking of Russia's flagship. So can you just close with why you think pushing back against the emergent conventional wisdom, even amongst military analysts, why do you think the Taiwan situation is a given?
Well, I mean, I go back to unrestricted warfare. I mean, the insight in terms of the Gulf War, I think was very prescient, and more importantly, when you study the weaponry that the Chinese have arrayed on their side of the strait, it is so overwhelming in terms of they don't run out of bullets. And when I'm talking about bullets, I'm talking about rockets and missiles that just continue to rain down on Taiwan. So there's no place to go. There's no place. It is literally, and they can just continuously just bombard the island until it looks like the surface of the moon. And so what I think about when I think about Taiwan is I think about the people, because I don't think the Chinese Communist Party thinks about the people. And so rather than thinking about how do we prevent the Chinese from taking Taiwan, they're going to take Taiwan. What I think about is how do we prevent massive death? And we can't prevent massive destruction to the extent that the Taiwanese resist, because the armament is so overwhelming in quantity, just in quantity. It is massive. And I think that's a thing that we don't pay enough attention to. Mass brings its own characteristics in terms of what you can hope to achieve. There will not be a single living thing on the island if the Chinese use all the weapons that they have arrayed on their side of the strait. That's what I react to.
Would they do that?
They would, because they don't care about the people. They only care about the ground. It is about the ground. And so they will use whatever means necessary. If you study the Chinese Communist Party, they are absolutely happy to sacrifice people. And you sacrifice people for the greater good of the Chinese nation, right? So they very much believe that the Chinese Communist Party is the one that's going to lead China back to its rightful place in the world, and that the social contract that enables them to do that. We can't do this without you. So our social contract is this: you give up all political freedom, and we will restore us to greatness. And when we do, some sacrifices will have to be made. They can be in the tens of millions. That's okay, because it's for the greater, in their mind. Yes, it's horrible to contemplate. It's horrible to contemplate that there could be an organization that thinks this way, but this is the way the Chinese Communist Party thinks. It's not about the people. It's really about the prestige of China, and more importantly, it's about maintaining control over the population. They have promised, and she has said, I'm not leaving it to the next generation. They have promised to bring Taiwan back into the fold, and Xi Jinping, I believe, plans to deliver on that promise come hell or high water, and whether or not any Taiwanese survive.
Well, we're not going to get that positive note that I was vaguely searching for. But on a positive note, though, I really enjoy your books. I'll save us from the precipice. Please shout out your two most recent books. Obviously, it's been in a bit, but like Stealth War still holds up. Obviously, you're taking a long picture to. So please shout the books out and we'll take it out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, please pick up War Without Rules. I think it's a great way to kind of contemplate these ideas. I wrote it. I love studying war. I love understanding about the history of war. I think War Without Rules, really, in a good way, highlights the incredible work of these two PLA colonels that really helps us understand the way the Chinese Communist Party thinks. And of course, Stealth War is my interpretation of my last years of service, where I really came to understand how the Chinese were fighting their fight.
General Spalding, thank you for joining us again on the Realignment.
Thank you so much.